Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to Masechet Megillah. In order to understand Masechet Megillah, we need to first pay attention to the fact that Masechet Megillah is composed of a riddle. As we might expect, Masechet Megillah talks a lot about Megillat Esther, but it only talks about Megillat Esther in the first two chapters of the Masechet. So the first chapter discusses the days on which we can read the Megillah. And in the Talmud, not in the Mishnah, but in the Bavli, we also find an extensive portion of dapim from the end of Daf Yud until the beginning of Daf Yud Zayin, which talk about agadatot, stories, narratives, midrashim, which are based on the psukim of Megillat Esther. Chapter 2 details all of the halachot, all of the laws of reading the Megillah, and who can do so for the community, for the tzibur. And as an extension of this discussion, there's also a discussion of mitzvot that must be performed specifically in the evening or specifically in the day. However, at that point, the discussion of the Megillah ends, and there's still another two chapters of the Masechet. So chapter 3, which confusingly is chapter 3 in the Mishnah, but chapter 4 in the Talmud, discusses the halachot of the sanctity of the synagogue, the sanctity of the Sefer Torah, and also discusses special kriot Torah, special readings for specific days of the year. Chapter 4, which, as I said, in the Talmud, in the Bavli, is chapter 3, discusses the laws of reading the Torah and reading the Haftarah, as well as the laws of communal prayer, of tefillah b'tzibur. Now, why are these chapters switched in the Talmud? It's not completely clear, but a scholar named Albeck suggested that this chapter, chapter 4, which starts with the words Hakoreh et Megillah, one who reads the Megillah, was put adjacent to chapter 2, which also starts with the words Hakoreh et Megillah, Hakoreh et Megillah lemafreah, so someone who reads the Megillah out of order. So in order to connect those two laws, the order of the chapters in the Talmud was changed. But here's the riddle. We saw that the first two chapters talk about Megillat Esther, but we notice that the last two chapters, no matter what the order is, don't actually talk about the Megillah. They're much more focused on Kriyat Torah in general, on the order of reading the Torah, and in general, communal prayers and the laws of tefillah b'tzibur. So what are these two parts of the Masechet doing together? And here's a second riddle in the Megillah, which is obviously a central mitzvah of the Chag. However, what's curious is that the other mitzvot are almost not discussed at all. There's a very strong focus on the reading of the Megillah, but not on the other mitzvot of the Seudah, the festive meal, matanot la'evyonim, giving charity, and mishloach manot. And what's interesting is that actually when we look at the verses in the Megillah, the opposite is true. So the Megillah itself doesn't say that there's an obligation to read the Megillah, but rather only focuses on the other mitzvot. Right at the end of Megillat Esther in chapter 9, there's a pasuk that says, "La'asot otam yemei mishteh v'simcha, u'mishloach manot ish lere'ehu, u'matanot la'evyonim." So there was an ordinance to make these days that will be a remembrance of the story of the Megillah, days of happiness and rejoicing, and of sending mishloach manot from one person to another, and matanot la'evyonim, and charity. But that's not at all the focus of our Masechet in the Talmud. those mitzvot are almost not discussed, while the one mitzvah that is not invoked at all in the Megillah itself, the mitzvah of Megillah, of reading the Megillah, that's the focus of the Masechet. So we have two riddles here. One is the riddle of why is the focus of the first half of the Masechet the Megillah and not the other mitzvot? And secondly, how do the two parts of the Masechet join together? And why is this so curious? I mean, we could say, okay, reading the Megillah and reading the Torah, that's what joins together. But we have to remember that we've already learned Masechet Brachot, and Masechet Brachot as a whole talks about tefillah. It gives a lot of space to Kriyat Shema, to Shmoneh Esrei, but in general, and to Brachot, of course, that's the Masechet that discusses prayer. So why not talk about tefillah b'tzibur, about reading the Torah in the context of that Masechet? Why is it here in Masechet Megillah, which we might have thought would focus only on the mitzvot that are related to Purim? So two suggestions have been offered in the past, basically two directions, both by the traditional mefarshim and by scholars. One is that each of these subjects, the subject of Purim, the mitzvot of Purim, and the subject of Kriyat Torah and communal prayer, was redacted by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the editor of the Mishnah. But each of these subjects ended up to be too short for a Masechet in and of itself. And since they both had to do with reading, then they were joined together. Another suggestion that has been offered is that actually this Masechet, even though it's called Megillah, its focus is really on reading from scripture in general. But the example of reading from the Megillah is just one example of reading from scriptures in general. However, these suggestions seem difficult since, first of all, the Masechet starts with the Megillah and gives it significant space. It doesn't talk about reading from other Megillot in such an extensive way. And so it doesn't seem like it's just, one example, but it does seem that there's a centrality to Purim and to Megillah. And so again, we need to ask the question of how reading Megillat Esther specifically is related to reading from the Torah and reading and communal practices of prayer in general. And what I want to suggest is that what's gluing these two parts of the Masechet together and the focus on the reading of the Megillah in general needs to be understood by going back and understanding the place of Megillat Esther within the books of the Tanakh as a whole. So if we look at the Tanakh as one book that's composed of 24 chapters, right, a progression of 24 books, then one of the most striking things that we see in the Megillah is that there's a trajectory of God's disappearance throughout the Megillah. From the books of the Torah, where God speaks directly to human beings, to the books of the Nevi'im, where God only speaks to very specific individuals and in a less direct way. And only through the Nevi'im does he pass on his message to the rest of the people of Israel. And finally, in the books of the Ketuvim, where we no longer hear God speaking directly at all. And in fact, what characterizes the books of the Ketuvim is that these are books where not only does God not turn to people, but people are the ones who turn to God. So these are the books where people are speaking to God despite the fact that they can't necessarily hear God's voice anymore. And the height of this trajectory of God's disappearance is famously found in Megillat Esther, right? Chazal say about Megillat Esther, Esther min haTorah minayin, from where do we learn, where is the origin in the Torah for Megillat Esther from the verse, Va'anochi haster asir. God says, I will hide my face. So Megillat Esther is Megillat HaHester. It's the Megillah of hiding, the Megillah in which famously God's name is not found even one time throughout the entire Megillah. And I think that the rabbis were very much aware of this, so much so that we'll see throughout the first chapter of Masechet Megillah several discussions that point to the fact that there was actually a great debate about whether Megillat Esther should even be included within the Kitvei HaKodesh, within the 24 books of the Tanakh, because it's a book which you can see as a kind of secular book, a book where God is not present in the Megillah at all. But alongside this trajectory over the Tanakh as a whole, which culminates in the book of Esther, we can also see that the vacuum that God creates by his tzimtzum, by limiting himself and not being so active anymore in the world, seems to be intentional, because God is actually pushing human beings to the front of the stage, right? If we think about the story of Megillat Esther, then the entire story is really focused on one moment where Esther realizes that she needs to stop being so passive and she has to start being active in order to take responsibility not only for her life, not only for the lives of the people who are close to her and around to her, but she needs to act on behalf of the people of Israel as a whole. And if she doesn't act, then she won't be able to save them and they will all be lost. And this moment is not only true of Megillat Esther, but it's true of all of the later books of the Tanakh. Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, all of these characters find themselves in some kind of moment of crisis, which pushes these heroes to transcend themselves and to go beyond their own personal lives in order to rescue their people as a whole. And so we hear also of Nehemiah, how he hears about his brothers, the She'erita Pleta, who are living in desperate straits, and how this pushes him to go out to the land of Israel in order to build and reconstruct Jerusalem. And so too Ezra HaSofer, who's going to be very important for us in a moment, he also instigates the new brit, the new covenant between the people of Israel and God. And it's clear that in contrast to previous britot in the Tanakh, where God is the one who takes the initiative, here Ezra, as a leader of the people, is the one who takes the initiative in order to create a new covenant between the people and God. And I think that the Talmud actually, in another place, in Masechet Shabbat, is very sensitive to this trajectory within the books of the Tanakh. And in Masechet Shabbat, we find a famous drasha on the pasuk Vayityatzvu betachtit hahar, the pasuk from the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that says that the people stood at the bottom of the mountain. And the drasha there in Masechet Shabbat has Rav Avdimi saying, what did God do? God held the mountain over the people of Israel and said to them, if you accept the Torah, that's good. If you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to drop the mountain on top of you and you're going to be buried there. So Rav Avdimi is expressing an idea that the Torah is something that is coerced on the people of Israel at Sinai. It's not something that they choose to do. However, Rava says that's true, that at Sinai there was an element of coercion. The people couldn't really choose to accept the Torah. However, in the days of Achashverosh, the people accepted the Torah from their own initiative. And he cites the verse, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, a verse from chapter 9 of Megillat Esther, and he says, Kimu ma shekiblu kvar. They accepted, they verified what they had already accepted in the past. So this means that the rabbis understood that this period of Megillat Esther and the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the last books of the Torah, when God is no longer present, and the fact that his presence is more hidden, it's more behind the scenes, that's what allows the people of Israel to accept the Torah in a more willful way, of their own volition, that it's not something that they were coerced to do because God is present, and how can you say no to God when you see him as at Mount Sinai, but rather they were able to accept the Torah in a way that was of their own free will and volition. And I think that against this backdrop, it's not surprising that Chazal used the same verse, Kimu v'kiblu, in order to also underwrite the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, which we said earlier is not written in the Megillah. There's actually no biblical basis for reading the Megillah. But in another place, the Chachamim say, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, שלושה דברים עשו בית דין של מטה והסכימו בית דין של מעלה על ידם. So there are three things that the court, the earthly court did, and the heavenly court agreed to. So it was instigated by the earthly court, and only then was it given a stamp of approval by the heavenly court. And what are these three things? Mikra Megillah, reading the Megillah, She'ilat Shalom Bashem, so greeting another person with the name of God, like saying Hashem Imachem, Ve'hava'at Ma'aser, and the bringing of tithes. And when he gives a verse for each of these practices that were created by human beings, he says, Mikra Megillah, Dichtiv Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. Kiblu lemala, ma shekiblu lemata. Okay, so the reading of the Megillah is based on the verse Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, that what was accepted below was also accepted above. Okay, so this is the Mikra Megillah is something that is not based on a biblical commandment. It's something that human beings decided is necessary in order to remember the miracle that happened in the time of the Megillah. And similarly, we also, if we go back to the structure of Masechet Megillah and what we said about Masechet Megillah, then we can also notice that the rabbis in several places say that the development of the takana of Kriyah Torah, it also emerged in this period. The period of Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the period in which the practice that we have of reading Kriyat Torah on Monday and on Thursday and on Shabbat and on Moadim, this is something that emerged in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah. So against this backdrop, both of the questions, both of the riddles that we asked at the beginning are answered, because what we see here is that Masechet Megillah actually deals not only with Kriyat Torah and not only with the mitzvot of Purim, but it deals with all of the main practices that create the tzibur, the community, in the period of Chazal. And the Masechet is drawing our attention to the fact that the rabbis are creating new practices in the period after the sealing of the Tanakh and the disappearance of Nevuah, of prophecy from the world, and also after the period of the destruction of the temple and the centrality of the practices around the temple and the sancta. And it's well known that the rabbis say that Chacham Adif mi Navi, a sage is greater than a prophet. And the rabbis created a new basis for Jewish life in this period by putting the Chacham, the Talmid Chacham, and the study of Torah as the center of Jewish life. But next to the centrality of study and the Torah as the core of Jewish life, there's also another core, another center, which is the synagogue and all of the practices that have to do with the synagogue, the tefillah b'tzibur, the reading of the Torah. These are central to Jewish life since the destruction of the temple. And the rabbis are pointing to the idea that they're taking their cue from the last books of the Tanakh, from Esther, from Ezra, from Nehemiah, and they're creating new practices. They have to innovate. They're continuing the trajectory that we see from the beginning of Jewish history, as it were, in the book of Genesis, where God is completely present in the 5 books of the Chumash, and slowly God disappears, and that gives more room for human development. And the rabbis in Masechet Megillah are arguing through the structure that they're creating here that it's not only the Megillah, which is kimu v'kiblu. It's not only the Megillah which they need to create and offer new practices for, but it's Jewish life as a whole and the creation of the community as a whole. And we see this, I think, very well in several halachot in this Masechet, which talk about the significance of the tzibur, of the minyan. The Masechet emphasizes the idea of v'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, that anything that is a davar shebakdusha, anything which has to do with sanctity, needs 10 people. And when those 10 people are present, then God dwells among the people. And so, for example, Mishnah Daled Gimel, Mishnah 4:3, talks about 10 different rituals that require 10 people. And the first 5 of those rituals actually detail the basis of the tefillah b'tzibur. So they talk about the core parts of the tefillah. They talk about Kriyat Torah, about the haftarah, the prayer of the shaliach tzibur, the birkat kohanim. And elsewhere in the Masechet talks a lot about the sanctity of the Bet Knesset and how you're not allowed to sell a Bet Knesset, for example. You're not allowed to sell objects of sanctity like the Sefer Torah and the surrounding objects. You're not allowed to sell them for other practices except for more sacred practices. So the Masechet is really emphasizing very much the importance of the tzibur, the importance of the structure of the Bet Knesset, the new institution that they're creating, which is sometimes called a mikdash me'at, but it's actually just emphasizing that there is no longer a mikdash. And so the rabbis need to create a new institution in order for people to be able to gather together and worship God. And in that way, they're continuing the same trajectory that we see in Megillat Esther, the Megillah, which is a really human Megillah, a Megillah which emphasizes human initiative and the need to be aware of the needs of the community. And through that, the Masechet is drawing together both Kriyat HaMegillah and Kriyat Torah as practices that are human practices for creating community and for bringing God's presence into the community. I hope you enjoy studying the Masechet, and I'll see you at the beginning of the next Masechet, Moed Katan.